art. I don't really think it's a super useful conversation, but just finding a model and sort of putting it to practice kind of works pretty well. So I'm going to talk about one specific model that I think is pretty simple and effective. It's a Charles Peirce's triadic semiotic model. So in this model, there are basically 3 elements to any sort of communication that might happen. It can be a stop sign. It can be, signage on the street. Really anything. So there's a representation that is the symbol or the form that you're creating or sending to the user. This can be an icon. This can be a picture or a photo. In the example I showed before, different symbols for bananas. There are different symbols for phones. There's banana. There was the word. I tripped over that. Symbol stands for. So that is sort of and that can be that's actually where the user lives, and that's actually the context is. And so things can change a lot based on the user's understanding or experiences. So you may want a symbol to represent, this particular thing, and you might want to, communicate to them, a phone, but they might look at it and say, well, that to me is just a banana, because I've never seen anybody talk to a banana and mean a phone. So that is where it becomes very important to understand who your users are, what are their contexts, what are the contexts that they're going to be coming across your software, and what is their base set of experiences in which they understand things. So I really think a lot when I'm going through this process of this particular part of the triangle, the interpretant or the signified. And this is the context, this is the user, this is their understanding, this is sort of the world in which they're operating in, that that your experience is going to be perceived in. So yeah, understanding a user's context and experience is encountered a phone at one point. They're, I guess, Muppets from Mars, and they were struggling for a while to figure out what this thing actually is. So they cycled through cat and cow, and then it rang, and they're like, oh yeah, it's a phone. So it's a really good video. You can click on it later if you want to. I'm not going to try because it'll probably break. Okay, so now we're going to refocus again to how all of this relates to software. I like to break down the ways that we communicate with our users to 4 main areas. There's probably more other designers break them out more and differently, but this seems to work. So the 4 main areas I see are engaging. How do we engage our users to kind of move through our software experiences, to click on calls to action, and to be inspired to continue to use your software. Then there's informing. So what are the different language breadcrumbs that we can use to lead the users through the experience and avoid confusion, or let them know what is the status of things or what exactly is going on. Another important one that I think is always challenging and often overlooked is how do we gather feedback from the user? Communication, as we know, at its best is a two-way street. And so without that feedback from the user, it's sort of just one-way communication. So I think that this is always a really important thing to think about when we're building software experiences. And then the fourth one is when shit happens, like fail, and we want to think about how we can build checks and balances into our software so that we can and avoid pain for our users and help get them back on track more quickly. So now I'm gonna dive in a little bit to each of the four areas and kind of give really simple case studies for each. I think that the case studies can be, it can be broken down a lot further, but we don't have a lot of time. So in the first area, engagement. This is kind of like maybe the first and most important, because we want people to get to your experience and be really excited to use it. And once they use it, keep going through the flows and continue to use it. And if you lose them through the sort of out of the box or first run, then you've failed in the engagement period. So a big part of this is how do you indicate to a user actions that are available to them and encourage them to interact. This thing here is actually something I saw when I was just walking around this neighborhood. It's a door knocker, and what I really liked about it is it's this object that it maps to what its purpose is, and it lets you know, like, this is for knocking on the door, and here you can knock on the door with this, and it invites you to knock on the door, which I was curious to do, but I didn't, because I didn't know who was there. I don't speak Catalan, so I skipped it. So how does this apply to software? So a good idea for user engagement is maybe greeting your users directly and suggesting things that they can do in the interface. So in Facebook, they suggest to you, like, hey, how's it going? Like, what's on your mind? And people will literally tell the world everything that's on their mind, whether you want to know or not. But it's effective. And then in the case of forms and fields, it's also really good to provide specific examples of the types of things that you're looking for them to input. Siri is another really good example, as she leads you through the process. She will suggest to you different things that you can ask her, different things that you can do to interact with it. So that's always really helpful, because if you're getting used to that experience and not quite comfortable with engaging it, it kind of like leads you in and sort of introduces you to that experience. Okay, here's a bad idea. So this is something you don't want to do to engage your users. Shaming your users into choosing your desired action flow is probably a bad idea. Or shaming them to opt into your product or service is probably a bad idea. So this one, it's like shaming people for not joining their health app. Like, that's kind of a bummer. Like, no thanks, I like to make bad choices. Another one is get the latest travel news, flight deals, and there's like, unlock my exclusive content, or no thanks, I'm a homebody. Like, that doesn't feel too good. So there's probably better ways to engage your users into trying out your service or opting into your content. Okay, now we're going to talk about informing. We're kind of being really brief in each of these areas. So how do you keep your users apprised of important system states, context changes, progress, or status without spamming them unnecessarily or creating anxiety or fear by sort of all of the excess information? This was something I saw. I was seeing these signs all over London last week, the danger of death. And they were kind of like scattered all throughout the city. And I guess it was kind of nice information to know, because I don't want to die, but it looks very extreme. And I'm really curious in all of those areas if there was serious danger of death. This one was particularly interesting because in addition to the actual sign, there's also barbed wire, which I think probably has a functional purpose, but it also is an effective symbol for, like, you probably shouldn't cross here, and it's a bad idea, and kind of go away. So it's kind of like a layering of symbols. So how do we apply this to software? So a good idea that's generally good is revealing to users how far along they are in a workflow, or how far along a process has to go, such as uploads or downloads. So, if you're going to have to wait a long time for a video to upload or a video to decode, then it's nice to see a progress bar. Or in the case of Vimeo, they kind of even had kind of a clever, like, microcopy to make it feel a little more personable. Like, your video will start converting soon. If you have other things to do besides stare at the screen, you can leave. I mean, I don't know. Different people have different opinions about making, like, cheeky commentary like that in microcopy. I'll talk briefly a little bit later about tone and kind of like when it's right to be cheeky and when you should be just straightforward and serious. But I think in this instance it works pretty well. I think another area that this is really important is sort of steps in a flow that sort of lead to something like purchasing. A user wants to know, like, okay, how much more information do I need to give? And at what point am I actually going to be charged for something? It's a little bit an online field. So kind of knowing when, like, okay, like, this is where I give you my home address info, and now is where I'm giving you my credit card info, and now, I'm going to be charged. So I think that having markers that indicate that flow is really helpful. And I mean, I think also it's helpful anytime there's a complicated multi-step process in a flow to keep users apprised to how much more they have to go. Let's see. Well, this one, this was another good idea. I didn't give a bad idea for this one. I think that it's a really good idea to have useful empty states, especially when the useful empty states can help onboard your users into core functionality and actions. So I like the one up above where it says, that, like, it's empty, you have no projects, but it's actually pointing you to the button that you need to click in order to create a project. So I think that's pretty cool, because it's like, even the character is kind of pointing you up there. And then in this case, this app called Drafts, like, there's these cute little empty states, and there's a button that's pretty clear of what you need to do. Let's see. Okay. Gathering feedback. I think that this is a really interesting one. It's probably one of the hardest for a lot of ways. I think that, in terms of privacy, in terms of sort of having, like, two-way communications from your users from a technical standpoint, from a metric standpoint, it's always a little bit more challenging to gather feedback from the users. But it can be really helpful in order to continue to improve your software experiences. And I think that it's really important to find ways to gain insights from your users in ways that are lightweight and encourages users to communicate in the right moments without interrupting their workflow or kind of like bogging them down and kind of slowing their work down unnecessarily. So this example here is like a kiosk that I've seen at airports kind of all over the world. I think I've been seeing them at a lot of different places. And I actually saw one here in Barcelona coming in, and I wish I was able to take a video of this site and use that as a case study, but that probably wouldn't have been nice. But there's a guy who is clearly displeased with whatever experience he had, and he was just pounding the unhappy button over and over and over again. So I think that that actually served a couple of purposes. I think that maybe, it was giving some good feedback to the airport that they weren't doing the best job, but I think that it also helped him feel like he was heard in some ways and provided a little bit of catharsis for an unpleasant experience. So he was clearly getting some satisfaction. So, it's like, like silver linings or something like that. I don't know. So, user feedback can be, a mode of catharsis for people. I mean, if you just look at Yelp, it's a sad reality that most people won't provide Yelp reviews unless they have had a bad experience, but they'll, have lots of great experiences and not review them. So, let's see. Okay, so gathering feedback, good idea. This is one of my favorite case studies. I really like what Lyft is doing to gather feedback from users about rides. And in this case, this good idea is encouraging specific feedback through very simple prompts. And the keyword here is simple, the keyword here is specific feedback with simple prompts and in the right context. And then also rewarding the user's feedback through delightful interactions. So there's a couple things that are going on here. One of them is, Lyft it's a rideshare app, so like obviously finding the right moment to ask for feedback is really important, because if you ask for it at the wrong time, then people are sort of like shuffling luggage or running across the street or doing other things that are probably more important than providing feedback to an app. So they're really good about asking for feedback when you're just sitting there in the car, probably doing nothing or checking Twitter or whatever else. So they'll ask you like some very specific things, like sometimes it's how is the pickup, or how is your route? And that's a big one when you do like the rideshare thing. Like sometimes the routes are really good and sometimes the routes are really bad. So in this case, they were asking me about how is the pickup. And there's 3 options, so I don't have to like think too hard about I don't have to write an essay about it. I'm like, okay, in this case, like it was all right. Like it wasn't it wasn't great. And it's like it gave me some simple options about, okay, like what wasn't great about it. And again, I don't have to like write it in or think too hard. I'm just, there's a couple of general options. And I told them, okay, it's the wrong spot. I had to like walk and find the driver. And then, I wasn't really upset. Like, I guess I wasn't in a huge rush and like it wasn't terrible. But there was this cute little animation with like turtles and bunnies hopping that kind of like made any irritation that I had about the pickup just kind of like float away, because, it was pretty cute. And they apologized and I accepted their apology. It was great. And I felt heard, which is also great. So, don't make your users work too hard in order to give you feedback. Solicit very specific feedback, because you'll probably gain better insights, but your users won't have as much cognitive load in terms of like thinking of what to write. Okay, this one's a really important one. Bad idea, I think, is I think asking for sensitive information without kind of providing like reasonable purposes for it is usually a bad idea. If you want to ask for sensitive information, you want to tell them like, okay, like what are you going to do with my information? And that's pretty clear. But also, some of the sensitive information is very personal, and if you're going to ask, like, you need to provide best, and they're usually pretty bad. These aren't real error states, but this is what happens when Daily Show writers discover UX writing, and they sort of like made up these error states for Disney, and they're pretty funny. I don't think that they're good for kids, but so good ideas for error states. Let's help our users fail gently and ease the frustration of software errors by providing useful and maybe even delightful errors and 404s. But in the best worlds, errors should address 3 main points. What was the problem? Why did it happen? And how do you solve it? How do you move forward? And so in both of these cases, like MailChimp is really great about a lot of this stuff. Like if there's something wrong in the entry form, they're really specific about, was it your username, was it, something else, and they give you a prompt to help you around that. In the case of this Lego website, it gives you a suggestion to go back to the Lego homepage instead of just like sitting there looking at a 404. And it's a pretty cute illustration. Bad ideas for error states. I mean, there's as many bad ideas as there are errors, so, and I'm sure we're all very familiar with them. But I think, among the top 40s of them are providing insufficient or intelligible error state information that puts you into infinite loops of sadness. In the case of forms, providing insufficient formatting hints that cause errors or missing info. So, if it's like kind of you need to type in your phone number and they want it just so, but the sort of formatting fields that help you along to do that, and then you just sit there having like errors over and over again trying to fill in a form. That's pretty annoying. Okay. So what makes good microcopy? Now we talked about it. Good microcopy is clear, concise, and ultimately useful. Good microcopy accounts for context and tonality. It's really good to know when to be funny, friendly, cheeky, serious. You don't want your bank to be like making jokes with you, but like MailChimp and some of these others, they kind of build a rapport with your users, and I think it can be nice, and you have to know when and kind of be careful there. This is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of microcopy and communicating with your users. I encourage everybody as they sort of like move through the world and experience various products and software to sort of take note of what are some great experiences and when you're communicating with your software or the software is communicating with you, and also what is some bad experiences, and try to understand a little bit about why, because then you can kind of apply those learnings to the software experiences that you yourself are creating, and we can hopefully make the world a happier digital place. So please join me on my quest for delight and usability. This is a couple of my emails that you can reach me at if you want to reach me through Endless. It's that, or for my personal design stuff. This is a cartoon about cookies. Click, click, click. By continuing to use this site, you agree to share your cookies. And they're like, there's always those things, and I've clicked yes all the time. So then there's this cookie monster on the other side who's ready to steal the world's cookies. So yeah, I don't know if we have any time for questions, but yeah, okay. Any questions? Cool. Yeah, you guys can feel free to find me and the remaining part of the conference if you want to chat about design or communication or usability or cookies or anything. I don't know. Yeah. Thank you.